Chapter 11, Note to 3rd edition. The experiments described in this chapter were directed to ascertaining the following point: would the results of individual experiments, properly conducted, be likely to favor or disfavor the popular view that the faculty for precognition, assuming this to exist, is possessed by only a few abnormal individuals? The experiment upon myself was a preliminary investigation to ascertain whether the frequency of the effect suggested normality and was high enough to render experiments on others worth making. The account of the following experiments, once again, is not scientific evidence, nor is it intended to be regarded as such. It is evidence for me, and part of my excuse for publication, but it is not, of course, evidence for the reader. Conviction, for him, must depend either on the convincingness of the arguments advanced in the concluding chapters, or else on the results which, according to the theory, he is likely to obtain if he makes the experiment himself, or upon both. Personally, I found this image hunting a fascinating and even exciting business. But it was a new kind of sport, and I made every possible blunder open to a raw beginner. Not only did I delay the attempt to recall the dream until I had been awake for half a minute or more, but I also failed to appreciate sufficiently the importance of detail in the written accounts. Incidents which should have been described in 50 words were recorded in 3. The result was that, although the 95 dreams yielded much that was suggestive of future experience, I could find little that was identifiable as belonging to either half of time. There was the shower of sparks dream recounted in the last chapter, and 5 slightly more doubtful results. There was one fully described image, the original of which was seen 4 years later, but that was outside the prescribed limits of the test. It was not, in fact, until the 11th day that I got the clear, conclusive result I had expected. On the afternoon of that day I was out shooting over some rough country. I was a little uncertain regarding the boundaries covered by the permission which I had obtained, and presently found myself on land where, I realized, I might have no right to be. As I crossed this, I heard 2 men shouting at me from different directions. They seemed, moreover, to be urging on a furiously barking dog. I made tracks for the nearest gate in the boundary wall, trying to look as if unaware of anything unusual. The shouting and barking came nearer and nearer. I walked a trifle faster, and managed to slip through the gate before the pursuers came into view. Altogether a most unpleasant episode for a sensitive individual, and one quite likely to make him dream thereof. On reading over my records that evening, I, at first, noticed nothing, and was just going to close the book, when my eye caught, written rather more faintly, right at the end, hunted by 2 men and a dog. And the amazing thing about it was that I had completely forgotten having had any such dream. I could not even recall having written it down. There was nothing identifiable on the 12th day, but the 13th gave another excellent result. During the day I read a novel in which one of the characters hid in a large secret loft in the roof of an old house. Later on in the story he had to fly from the house, and escaped from the loft by way of a chimney. The previous night's dream was about a large, mysterious, secret loft, which I discovered and explored with great interest. A little later in the dream it became advisable for me to escape from the house, and I decided to do this by way of the loft. On the 14th night I had for the hot cross-bun results. The net result of the experiment was that in the course of a fortnight I had been able to identify 2 conclusive instances of the effect, and 6 which, though not conclusive when regarded singly, could scarcely be attributed to coincidence when their number was taken into account. But the most important point was this: not one of those instances would ever have been observed at all, had not the dreams been memorized and written down, and the records re-inspected after the waking events. So far, then, the theory that the effect was merely a normal characteristic of man's general relationship to time, but one so constituted as to elude casual observation, had been partly borne out by experiment. But, on that theory, the effect in question should be just as experimentally observable to everyone else as it was to myself. This meant that I must persuade another person to make a similar trial. A young woman, whom I will call Miss B, good-naturedly agreed to undertake the task. I selected her mainly because she was an extremely normal individual, who had never had any sort of psychical experience, and who believed that she practically never dreamed at all. Indeed, she assured me that it would be useless for her to experiment, as she had only had some 6 or 7 dreams in the whole course of her life. The morning after the first night she came to me and told me that it was quite hopeless. She had tried to remember her dreams the very instant she woke, but there had been nothing to remember. So I told her not to bother about looking for memories of dreams, but to endeavor instead to recollect what she had been thinking at the moment of waking, and, after she had got that, to try to recall why she had been thinking it. That worked, as I had known it would, and on each of the next 6 mornings she was able to remember that she had had one short dream. Counting the experiment as starting from the first dream, she obtained, on the 6th day, the following result. Waiting at Plymouth Station for a train, she walked up to one end of a platform and came upon a 5 or 6 barred gate leading onto a road. As she reached the gate a man passed on the other side, driving 3 brown cows. He was holding the stick out over the cows in a peculiar fashion, as if it were a fishing rod. In the dream, she walked up a path she knew, and found, to her great surprise, that it ended in a 5 or 6 barred gate which had no business to be there. The gate was just like the one at the station, and, as she reached it, the man and the 3 brown cows passed on the other side, exactly as in the waking experience, the man holding out the stick fishing rod fashion over the cows, and the whole group being arranged just like the group she saw. The dream occurred the morning before the waking experience. The blending of the past image of the path with the future image of the gate provided an excellent specimen of integration. I then asked my cousin, Miss C, to try. She was positive that she had never had any experience of this kind, and was sure that, as a general rule, she dreamed very little. She proved excellent at recovering the lost dreams, and good at noting detail. But at first she was very weak at perceiving connections, even with past events. She could not, for example, understand how a dream of walking on roofs could be connected with the experience of climbing about the roof of a bungalow with me on the previous day, though she had not been on a roof of any sort for years. She obtained, however, on the 8th day, the following first-class result. Immediately upon her arrival at a certain country hotel, she was told of a curious person staying there whom all the guests suspected, having made up their minds that she was a German. Shortly afterwards she met this person, for the first time, in the hotel grounds. These are rather uncommon. They extend a long way, contain numbers of large, rare trees, and would certainly be taken for public gardens by anyone who did not know that they belonged to the hotel. The supposed German was dressed in a black skirt with a black and white striped blouse, and had her hair scraped back in a bunt on the top of her head. My cousin's dream was that a German woman, dressed in a black skirt, with a black and white striped blouse, and having her hair scraped back in a bunt on the top of her head, met her in a public garden. My cousin suspected her of being a spy. The dream occurred about 2 days before the event. She had already had one almost, but not quite, conclusive result earlier in the experiment, a dream connected with some news in a letter she subsequently received from a friend. Mrs. L., the next person to try, got an excellent result on the very first night. It related, however, to 2 separate experiences which occurred during the following week. The 2-day limit was here exceeded, but the correspondence was so clear that the result came under the rule permitting an extension of the limit in exceptional cases. The waking experiences concerned 2 public meetings at Corwen. Mrs. L. went to one of these, and, in describing it to me afterwards, told me she was surprised at the large number of clergymen who seemed to have arrived out of the void to fill the building, for it did not seem to her that there was anything in the business before the meeting which could be of special interest to the church. She was not present at the other meeting. But my sister was there, and she told Mrs. L. of her experiences. On putting her head in at the door she found a regular pandemonium in progress. She was about to withdraw discreetly, when the chairman, catching sight of her, called out, "Come in, Miss Dunne, and see how we Welsh fight." In Mrs. L.'s dream she was at a public meeting, and was greatly annoyed by the interruptions of a clergyman in the audience, who, instead of allowing the business to proceed, insisted on preaching a sort of sermon ending in a prayer. She expostulated. The clergyman leaned so far back that he touched her. Another man in the audience pushed against her arm. She rose, and, thumping a table, cried, "Who is responsible for the behavior of the audience? I know the Welsh are notorious for bad behavior in public, but I will not have it here." Mrs. L. forgot all about this dream after writing it down. Its record was not reread by her after the 2nd day, and so she missed it when the 2 meetings occurred later in the week. It was only by chance that I happened to look back through the notes and discover it. Major F., the next person approached, entered upon the experiment with considerable interest. He pointed out that, if there were anything in this business, it might mean the spotting of a Derby winner. He finished satisfied that I was perfectly right, but also satisfied, I am afraid, that the dreaming mind did not properly understand its business. He happens to be a marine artist of considerable reputation, and on the 2nd day of the test he set forth to paint a couple of boats which he had previously seen lying on the beach. But he found that one boat, which was pointed at both bow and stern, had been painted, since his last visit, in staring lifeboat colors. However, he made his sketch, a process necessitating, of course, long and close attention to the boat and its colors. The vessel stood on short, green turf. Some distance away, on a pier which came into the picture, was another long, red, somewhat boat-like object with something draped across its middle. Major F. took field glasses to ascertain what this stuff was, and discovered it to be a net. The associated dream image was that of a red and blue lifeboat standing on green turf with a net draped over its middle. This dream had occurred during the previous night. Major F., at first, could not see the connection. He thought that the similarity ought to have extended to everything else in the dream scene, and was disappointed that this had not been the case. However, he continued the trial. On the next day it rained heavily, and we both set out to look for a sheltered place from which to paint pictures. We entered a small house which was in course of construction, and, finding the view from the lower windows too restricted, erected a ladder against the cross beams of the unfinished upper story, and climbed up onto these. The ladder was a rather unusual one, in that it had square rungs. One of Major F.'s dreams on the preceding night had been that he was climbing a ladder which did not appear to be set against any wall. It went up, so to say, into space. And it had square rungs. He had not been up a ladder for 6 years. What finally convinced him, however, was this: he dreamed that he was sailing a toy boat with a small boy protege of his to whom he had presented this vessel. A little later on he dreamed he saw a similar boat, but full size, dismasted, and with its sails lying flat on the water. The crew were washing them. A few days after this he heard that his boy friend had been taken to a pond to sail his new boat, but instead of doing so had insisted on removing the sails, laying them flat in the water of the pond and scrubbing them. He agreed that these 3 results, taken together, were conclusive. Chapter 12. The situation was my brother had written to me to say that he had got the post-war death of General Lemon, one which was apparent only to definitely directed his newspaper and its failure to attract general attention confronting him. Thus, sufficiently explained. My sister, like my brother, but the rough hand-ready method without the necessity of experiment for the purpose of rendering it perceptible seemed to work quite well. Extended into a department the original of science hypothesis of solitary abnormality had been completely killed, and here, moreover, although an ignoramus, I am humble, I did not appear to take her word especially that the correspondence of events in this case was sufficiently detailed to put those other people had got their decisive results more quickly than conclusive that my experience, in most cases, in these special results had been clearer, was opposed to the popular view. The outcome of the experiment suggested that the number of persons who would be able to perceive precognition was approximately equal to that of those so large as to render any idea of abnormality absurd. Miss B had only one dream resembling a distinctive waking incident of the past within the preceding fortnight, everyone has occasionally experienced that queer sense of events having happened before, and that most I have said earlier, to recall Mrs. L had only one dream because some chronologically which reminds incident in the past. It became fairly clear I questioned her if there were abnormality during the test, it would probably as her pertain to the voluminous, if such there and should I was puzzled by her apparent mentally to get results from observing the effect. I omitted to record how many of major FS dream incidents appear to be collected only from experiments conducted on a widespread scale. To the best of my recollection, there was only one of a book. 106. Meanwhile, the explanation seemed as far away as ever. The trouble was that the effect was so extremely definite in its aspects. It was no broad, vague affair such as might be covered by some sweeping generalization. It bristled with peculiarities. It presented clues which pointed like signposts to half a dozen solutions, mostly contradictory. And, though it was easy to devise explanations which should cover some of the facts, it was difficult to find anything which could fit them all. In the hope of obtaining additional data, I recommenced experimenting upon myself, the immediate object being to ascertain whether there were any observable differences between the images which related to the future and those which related to the past. As it turned out, the most careful observation failed to bring to view any such distinguishing features. In the course of these further experiments, however, I came upon 3 dreams of a specially illuminative kind, and these, perhaps, had best briefly be described. The first afforded a fairly clear example of an associational chain running from past to future. The connecting link was the idea of spilled ink, which idea entered into both the related waking experiences. Waking experience, before the dream, watched a friend seated at a table filling a fountain pen, and thought he was going to spill the ink. Waking experience, after the dream, read a French detective story. The detective seemed to be unusually incompetent, and, towards the end of the book, I began to wonder when he was going to exhibit some sign of the skill with which the reader had been asked to credit him. In the denouement he pretended to stumble, and, in so doing, upset some ink over a table at which the villain was seated. The latter, to save his clothes, threw himself back in his chair, raising his hands above the flood. Whereupon, the detective seized one hand and slapped it down first into the ink and then onto a piece of blotting paper, thus obtaining a set of fingerprints. He then triumphantly denounced the criminal. Dream, between the 2 waking experiences, a famous detective was going to give us an exhibition of his skill. We waited a long time, but he seemed quite incompetent. Finally, he pretended to stumble, and, in so doing, spilled ink from a fountain pen over the criminal, whom he then triumphantly denounced. The second dream exhibited a similar associational chain, but in this case the link, shooting dangerous game with a revolver, was much clearer. Waking experience, before the dream, saw pictures of a lion shooting expedition. My brother was thinking, at the time, of joining such an expedition, and I began to wonder what guns he ought to take. While considering the merits and demerits of various weapons, I was reminded of an enormous 7-chambered revolver I had seen in a Paris gun shop, which apparatus was supposed to be part of the equipment of any up-to-date hunter of lions. I wondered, with some amusement, what lion shooting with a revolver would be like. Waking experience, after the dream, read Ethel Sidgwick's Hatchways. 2 chapters are devoted to the episode of a leopard, which has escaped from a menagerie. It has appeared near a country house where a sort of children's school treat is in progress, and has killed a goat. Later on, the hero is saved from the animal by a retired explorer, who arrives in the nick of time and kills the beast with 2 shots from a borrowed revolver. Dream between the 2 waking experiences, looking from the windows of a country house, saw the head and shoulders of a lion moving through a cornfield. It was known in the neighborhood that this lion had escaped from a menagerie, and that it had killed a goat. Wondered if I could hit it from the window with my revolver, but decided that the range was too great. Decided to lie up alongside the track in the cornfield, and to wait till the beast repassed. Felt, however, that I should prefer to be armed with something better than a revolver. Went out to try to get a rifle. The third dream provided an example of a perfect integration, the component parts of which were related to impressions received before and after the dream. Waking experience, before the dream, saw in the garden of an hotel where I was staying the bottom, minus the sides, of an old, small, flat-bottomed boat. Waking experience, after the dream, my sister persuaded me to go with her to one of the Olympia motorcycle shows, as she wanted my opinion on a small scooter which had caught her fancy. It was a neat-looking little thing called the Unibus, and it was entirely different from the other scooters in the show, inasmuch as it was built on motorcar principles, with shaft, gearbox, etc. It was equipped with a little seat of curious shape. Also, it was fitted with a shield for the protection of ladies' dresses. I pointed out the advantages of this last feature, and added that in ordinary scooters she would get her feet horribly wet and muddy. As I said that, there flashed through my mind the old curious conviction, this has happened before. Knowing what that meant, I set to work and presently revived the lost memory. It belonged to a dream, and what was more, a dream which I had recorded. On my return home I looked up the notes, and found that they had been made 2 years before. Dream, between the 2 waking experiences, saw my sister coming down a street, sitting in an extremely curious little motor car. Called out to her something about getting her feet wet. Saw water in the roadway up to the level of the low, oval platform. The note stated that the platform of this tiny car was the piece of a flat-bottomed boat I had seen 9 or 10 days before. Since we have got on to the subject of long-range association with a dream in the middle, I may as well describe the most perfect example of the kind I have ever experienced. The gap between dream and future event was about 20 years. Waking experience, before the dream, when a small boy, between 12 and 14, I read with enormous interest Jules Verne's Clipper of the Clouds. Readers of that book will probably remember the illustrations of the author's idea of a flying machine. These showed a long, dark hull of about the size and shape of a modern destroyer, except that it had a ram bow. This thing, which looked as if it had got off the sea and into the air by mistake, was supported solely by a cloud of tiny screw propellers mounted on a forest of thin metal masts. There were no wings, or anything of that sort. Waking experience, after the dream, some 20 years later, in 1910, I made the first decisive flight in the first aeroplane which possessed complete inherent stability. It was a rather exciting episode. The thing got off too soon, bounced, and, when I recovered my scattered wits, I found it roaring away over the aerodrome boundary, climbing evenly, and steady as a rock. So I left well alone and allowed it to look after itself. This it did till the engine gave out. The sensation was most extraordinary. The machine, like all those of my design, was tailless and shaped, as viewed from below, like a broad arrowhead minus the shaft. It travelled point foremost, and, at that point, there was fitted a structure like an open canoe, made of white canvas stretched over a light wooden framework. Seated idly in this, and looking down over the sides at the cattle scampering wildly around 300 feet below, the whole of the main structure of the aeroplane was away back behind the field of vision, and the effect produced was that one was travelling through the void in a simple open canoe. Dream, between the two waking experiences, a few days after I had read, as a small boy, Jules Verne's book, I dreamed that I had invented a flying machine, and was travelling through space therein. It must be borne in mind that I had never heard of, or conceived the possibility of, any flying machine different from the great metallic, screw-supported clipper of the clouds. Yet in my dream I was seated in a tiny open boat constructed of some whitish material on a wooden framework. I was doing no steering, and there was no sign of anything supporting the boat. I may add here that the boat-like nacelle of the Dunne biplane had not been added on account of any lingering, unrecognized memory of the dream. The earlier machines had no such feature. This had been attached as an afterthought, simply in order to reduce the head resistance of the pilot, which resistance, at that particular place, was believed to exercise a detrimental effect upon the stability of the apparatus. I never forgot that dream, and recalled it with amusement when, in 1901, being on sick leave from the Boer War, I set to work in earnest to devise some heavier-than-air contrivance, which should solve the great military problem of reconnaissance. But it seemed to me a dream natural enough for a boy, and I did not then perceive the significance of the appearance of the dream machine. Indeed, I could not do so, for the related constructional development did not come till 10 years later. By then I had dismissed the dream as of no importance, and it was only recently that I realized that the corroborative detail of the little, white, open boat classified the whole as an anticipation of future experience. Granted that the dreaming attention ranges about the associational network without paying heed to any particular present, there is nothing astonishing in its lighting on an image many years ahead. This, in fact, is exactly what we should expect, for in its backward travel it often lights on images many years behind. But when it comes to computing the proportion which the images of the past bear to the images of the future in a given series of dreams, one is apt to be misled. For the images which relate to events a long way behind can be recognized and counted. But those which relate to events similar distances ahead cannot be identified. Hence, the only way to strike a balance is to confine the statistics to the range of a few days either way. Images which relate equally well to either past or future, such as those of friends, and of everyday scenes, should not be counted. Images which are apparently of the past should be submitted to the same severe scrutiny as are those which are apparently of the future, for coincidence will operate just as effectively in either direction. Computing in this fashion, I have found that the images which relate indisputably to the nearby future are about equal in number to those which pertain similarly indisputably to the nearby past. Note to third edition. The paragraph italicized above was written 7 years ago, and I marvel that I did not realize then that I had sketched the outlines of a statistical experiment far more convincing and immensely simpler than the one previously described. It would require to be conducted on a far larger scale. But that done, it would provide much better evidence of the probable distribution among individuals of any precognitive faculty that might be presumed to exist. Moreover, if the scale were sufficiently large, it might even produce irrefutable scientific proof of the fact of precognition. It was not, however, until 1932 that all this dawned upon me. Then I conducted promptly a small-scale experiment upon these lines. The results were overwhelmingly in favor of the new dream theory. They are given in the appendix to this book. My less striking results had been more numerous than those of my assistants, but then, so had been my results similarly evidential of retrospection. There was nothing to show that I differed from the other experimenters except in a superior aptitude for spotting results both ways. Mr. L. Gibbs had previously persuaded a similar machine of my design to leave the ground, but the flight on that occasion was limited to a few yards.